Can you hear me now, Robert?
Yes, that's better. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I just didn't want to lose sight of something that I want to clarify what you said. Did you say a 0.25% change in SCAPE can lead to a double-digit increase in the contribution rate in fire?
Yes.
Because this is the consultation isn't on fire; it is on public sector, but that's a really important matter that fire needs to somehow feed into, or with the methodology, because looking how volatile the SCAPE rate can be, that has huge impacts. And I'd be really interested in why it affects fire so dramatically, because others in the consultation won't respond to that. Can you just clarify that? Or did I understand you correctly?
You did entirely, yes. So the SCAPE rate has a larger impact on different public sector schemes. I think the range is between 4 and 11%, and fire is right at that top end. It's the nature of the benefits and the period over which the benefits will be paid relative to them being accrued. Fire scheme relative to the other public sector schemes has a lower retirement age on average, so there's more years of payment. And similar to, yeah, so the fire scheme and the police scheme are very sensitive to discount rate changes, more so than the others. It's not a zero impact for the others, it's just a lower one. So, and they're all fairly substantial. So I think, as I said, the lower end is 4%, which is not an immaterial change to your discount rate, particularly for only for a 0.25 change in the discount rate. It's a very sensitive figure, just because it backs up every single year of every single payment in the future. It's the most sensitive financial assumption because it affects every member, regardless of age and type and benefit structure.
Thanks for clarifying that. We're very happy to be an outlier, but we prefer the 4% end rather than the 11% end if we're going to be an outlier. Thank you for clarifying that, Robert. No
problem. And Craig.
Thanks, Robert. It's Craig here from First Actuarial. Just one kind of initial observation on this is that I'm right in thinking that the current methodology of GDP based is set using GDP projections that are set by the OBR, and the proposal essentially is the Treasury want to move to the social time preference rate, which is set by Treasury. So as I understand it, I'm happy to be corrected, but is there a risk there, do you think, of kind of public perception?
Well, obviously, yes. I can't say anything directly on Treasury policy. I think Sam wants to jump in on this from GAD as well.
Yeah, happy to jump in here. So there is actually a full paper online that you can find that talks about how the social time preference rate is set. You'll see there that it also does have a reference to GDP. I think it's just the fact that the STPR hasn't actually been reviewed as regularly as the SCAPE discount rate has been. So I think the current methodology for STPR is that you have 1 times some estimate of GDP growth, which at the time was about 2%, and there's an addition of another factor. So I think it's the frequency of review that has been the key difference there. And as you say, Treasury have got control over when they do and when they don't review these things.
So more stability rather than control potentially being the driver.
But yeah, potentially, yeah.
Thanks, both.
And it's probably worth noting that while GDP is below STPR at the moment, there's no guarantee that that is the way they will sit in the future. It just happened to be at the moment, and it depends on the timing of the reviews and what you're including in STPR. There was quite a section in the consultation that they may strip out some of the elements. I mentioned briefly about one thing they were potentially removing is the catastrophe risk, which is worth about 1%, and that can bring it much closer. Obviously, Treasury are pointing out that this review is not about the number that forms the SCAPE rate, but rather the methodology that backs up that number. Right. So what would happen is after the consultation and the methodology is decided, there would be a numerical review of the SCAPE rate, where the next one set going forwards will be the outcome. So this consultation will not provide the new number; it will just provide the methodology underlying that number. Yeah. So Roger.
Thank you. So just to check my understanding, really, if I understand correctly, STPR is a required rate of return rate set by Treasury for investment, where they want to see investment into new ventures which are going to generate a bigger rate of social return than natural GDP growth, whereas the current benchmark we use for discount is related to GDP. So if we were to use STPR, we would de facto be forcing ourselves to raise taxation to pay for it, because we wouldn't naturally be seeing our taxation rates grow in line with GDPR as they normally are. We'd be demanding they grow faster. Is that right? Is that correct?
I believe that is broadly correct, yes. So one of the reasons GDPR was picked in 2011 is it's seen as a proxy for the growth in the tax base, and that's where pensions are paid from. Obviously, yeah, if STPR is above that, that is an expectation that growth is higher than the growth in the tax base, essentially.
So we'd be setting ourselves the objective of raising taxes to pay for this.
Well, we can't speak for how Treasury would end up then paying for it, but it's if they still believe that the GDP measure is the best way of measuring the growth in the tax base, and STPR is higher than that, then there is that potential mix match. But obviously, yeah, we can't speak for Treasury's policy on why between the two. But that is a good point.
Can I follow that up? The OBR numbers have moved around an awful lot, as we've seen. Over what term is that long-term estimate expected to apply?
That is a good point. Sam, do you know the answer to that? Because I don't off the top of my head.
No, so OBR do a reassessment broadly every year, and what I can't tell you straight off the top of my head is what's considered short term and what's considered long term. But it's not like OBR say, oh, this is our long term estimate, and we're not going to change our long term estimate for the next 3 or 4 years. They say this is our long term estimate, i.e., we're not thinking about the next 5 years. It's probably about 5-year short term thing that they've got. We're thinking about 5 years plus. What do we think? But they reassess that every year. So
but it's not the 40 years of a pension scheme, for example, because I mean, if it's going to grow, but the whole economy is going to grow by 1% less in their view over the next 40 years, that's a serious contraction that's in there.
Yeah. Yeah. And now I don't know what the limit of the long term is considered to be. I'll look that up now while we're at it.
I couldn't find the 1.8% in the paper referred to, so.
I think so. I don't think that's in any of the papers. I think that's people doing calculations based on the stuff that is in the paper.
Can I just ask a question as well? And apologies if it's a bit of a silly question, and I should have picked it up from the consultation, but what were the reasons for moving away from STPR in the first place? I'm just trying to get my head around. We had one, we went for another for 10 years, and then we're going back to it, and sort of just understanding that a little bit more.
So my understanding of that decision, it was based around, as I said before, the pensions are essentially paid from the tax base, and it was Treasury's belief that GDP growth, matches up to the growth in the tax base more closely than STPR. So therefore, it was an appropriate measure for that growth. That's my understanding of the outcome of the previous consultation from 2010 to set it from 2011.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's that better alignment of the thing that they think is going to be covering off the pension costs to the costs themselves. They also want to make sure that there isn't, a disproportionate cost now for what's likely to be paid out in the future.
So that was going to make my second question is, do you think it would have been as likely that they would have done this consultation if you didn't have this huge effect on the contributions? So 11% for 0.25 change and there's 0.6 change is going to be huge. Would if that had not had that difference, do you think, is there anything in the consultation that points to that they would they still, I know they had a requirement to consult, but do you think they would have gone with a different preference or a different recommendation?
So yeah, as you said, this is they did say in the last consultation they would consult every 10 years. So it's difficult to say whether or not it's a coincidence that this is happening at the 10-year anniversary while there is a potential fall in the discount rate and therefore a significant cost increase. So yeah, I couldn't say anything about the timing of their consultation.
Thank you.
They had an objective the last time round. I think stability was one of their objectives, even 10 years ago. But they had an objective of transparency and simplicity. That seems to have gone without any sort of mention. And obviously, you're not responsible in any way. In fact, it's my understanding that government wasn't actually consulted on this paper or didn't provide advice to Treasury on it. This is
no. So yeah, the government actually only carried out a view on the cost cap mechanism, and it just the timing of the discount rate consultation. Yeah. So yeah, obviously yes. If you feel that that objective has fallen away, that's a good question for your Treasury engagement session when that comes along.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions on any other questions on the discount rate before I move on to the cost cap? Let's wait a few seconds, see if there's any hands. Oh, great. I'm going to move on to the cost cap now. So
one second, just in the absence of another question, I just wanted to flag, it's mentioned early on in the paper that there are other uses that we use the SCAPE discount rate for. And at the moment we use the SCAPE discount rate for setting factors as well. Now, the key thing that differentiates the fire scheme from many of the other schemes is that you have commutation factors that are actuarially cost neutral. And so at the moment we use the SCAPE discount rate to set those commutation factors, which I know are, you know, really important to members of the scheme. So we need to just be mindful that, you know, changes to the SCAPE rate could have an impact on the commutation factors. It's not necessarily a definite link because there's no legislative link between the factors and the SCAPE rate. I'm not aware that it says anywhere that we must use the SCAPE rate to set those factors. That's just what we've done in the past, and maybe should we get a change that we don't think is appropriate, then we need to think a bit harder about the discount rate that we use for commutation factors. So it's not to say that your thoughts about the link to commutation factors should change how you feel the SCAPE rate should be set, but you know, just bear that in mind, and it might be something that we could need to consider down the line.
Who's it's the power to set it is Home Office, the scheme manager in consultation with the government actuary, presumably.
The government actuary just sets the commutation factors.
So it will ultimately be your decision.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is it just worth confirming as well that all things equal, a falling discount rate means higher factors and vice versa, just in case that wasn't immediately obvious to the group?
Yeah. Des, your hands are going up.
Yeah, can I just pick up that point, but Samantha, so GAD used the SCAPE to set the commutation factors. I understand that. But did you just say, but it's your decision if you want to use something else to set it?
Yeah, we need to consider what we think is appropriate for assessing cost neutrality for our members.
Right. I mean, you would have thought that there'd be some consultation with the people on the receiving end of that, i.e. the members of the scheme, because, you know, the fact that the commutation tables are published have been, you know, I've been in the service for 40 years and I see the commutation tables published. And yes, over the years, I've seen them change. I never really knew how or why they were set. But if there is a methodology, then there's a methodology. But it does seem wrong if it's in the hands of one body to decide whether to use a different factor without any discussion with the people on the receiving end. Is it? Can you just clarify that, Samantha, how that might work? Would there be any, if you chose to move to a different rationale, i.e. from SCAPE to something else, would you consult with the employers and the employees on that?
I don't think we would. So when you've seen the commutation factors change in the past, that's because, you know, we've had some additional information come through around mortality assumptions or, you know, other economic factors, and we've never run any consultations there. We have just, you know, the regulations are quite clear that the government actuary has to determine something around, you know, cost neutral actuarial factors for commutation. And I think if we were to start going out to consultation and taking on board the views of the members who are about to receive the benefit, then there could be some sort of biases getting introduced. So I think in our sort of professional capacity, it's left to us to come up with what seems appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I understand all the points you're making. It just seems that if Scape is being used, then you should continue using that. And if you want to move to something different, that's when because the Scape will change and you'll just implement it. Inflation factors will change, but because whilst you said there could be biases on the employer or employee side about it, one could argue that there could even be professional biases in the body that decide we're going to move to something else.
Well, yeah, we've got a requirement to act impartially.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
You know, we have to just go with a sort of a best estimate. So hopefully, you know, you don't have too many fears that we might be biased in what we're doing. You know, we're not on Treasury side, we're not on the Home Office side. You know, we are.
I'm not going to dwell on it. Thank you for just making that clear, Samantha.
Yeah.
Before we move on as well, can I ask about the short-term assumptions, which will all need revising if the approach is changed, and who will be setting that? There's a sort of missing element in the consultation in many ways. Those short-term assumptions were set in Treasury directions, I think, but presumably based on actuarial advice again, or I don't know. How will it work?
So Treasury, as far as I'm aware, the short-term ones, the directions the Treasury set them fairly robustly themselves, and it's often relative to CPI in general. So most of is this all the financial short-term assumptions, or are you just meaning the discount rate short-term?
Well, there's mention of of taking into account salary increases, for example. I know you've adjusted for short-term CPI and that sort of thing, yet you're using a very stable long-term discount rate. There's something surely actuarially that needs considering within that, I guess.
Yeah, so yeah, those, when they come to us as client-facing and to do the valuation, they are set. And there is the probable slight consultation between Treasury-facing GAD when setting them, but they are Treasuries to set, as far as I'm aware. Sam, please correct me.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you know, there's a formal mechanism around consultation for the scape rate, but the short-term assumptions, that we don't have a mechanism to the one that we've got here.
There's no principles being set for them. You know, we're being consulted on part of it, but not on how the short-term assumptions will get set.
I think that's a really good thing to raise as part of the response. You know, you want.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. If there's no more questions on scape rate, I'll move on to the cost cap. I wasn't intending to do a review of the cost cap mechanism itself. I think we've spoken about that in SAB meetings enough. I was just going to jump into the government actuary's report. So in particular, he was asked to answer two questions. One was, did the mechanism work as intended during the 2016 valuation? And then some recommendations for potential changes to the cost cap mechanism so that it more closely matches the objectives. Worth pointing out this point that the review was planned even before the pause, unpause, McLeod inclusion, exclusion discussion. So there was a plan to review this cost cap, as it was the first time it worked before the evaluation worked its way out to the results that we're seeing now. And so the main findings within the government actuary's report were the main drivers to so this is talking about the reduction in the cost cap, so the pre-McLeod results, which were showing a floor breach. So the main drivers of that reduction downwards were mortality and the financial assumption changes. And in particular, that the legacy schemes drove those changes. So the inclusion of the future service in the legacy schemes drove that, because of the design of the 2015 scheme being a care scheme, and with a slightly higher retirement age. For example, pay increases are mitigated because of the design of the care scheme slightly. And there was also a line that the 2016 valuation gave a slightly strange set of results when you compare the cost cap result to the employer contribution rate result. So you had the cost cap, which was a floor breach, suggesting that benefits were cheaper than expected. But then you had quite a significant rise in the employer contribution rate. And so that had two things offsetting, which don't necessarily go hand in hand, both cheaper and more expensive at the same time. But that was due to what was and wasn't included in the cost cap. In particular, that last change in the escape rate from 2.8 to 2.4 didn't come through the cost cap, and that's one of the big drivers, as we've spoken about, of the increase in the employer contribution rate. And on the back of that, Treasury in their consultation have suggested that the elements that caused the floor breach in the 2016 could maybe not be described as extraordinary events, and they were kind of normal changes to assumptions that you might see between two valuations. So a slight reduction in future life expectancies or small changes to salary assumptions. So they suggest they were not the extraordinary events that the cost cap was designed to capture. So as part of the recommendations for changes, these are set out in the slide that's on the screen. So the first one is to include just the reform scheme only, and to consider both the past and future service of that scheme. And that would mean that those whose benefits would be changed by the cost cap process are the benefits that are measured within the cost cap process. The second one was to widen the corridor slightly, to mean that there was less volatility in the process and that more substantial changes would be required to trigger a breach. And then the third one is to stop the potential of a slightly strange set of results, that in the background there would be an economic check going on, that when you get the result of the cost cap, you then match that to a general economic result. But in this case, you'd be looking maybe where the discount rate has changed and where the employer contribution rate has gone, so that the results match up more closely, so that people aren't seeing benefit reductions in a period where there's good economic growth, or vice versa, but they're not seeing benefit increases when the cost of the schemes as a whole is going up. So from these proposals, these are the potential proposals put forward by the government actuary, and then the Treasury have put them forward in their consultation document. In particular, one was that the change in the corridor will change the likelihood of breaches occurring in the future. And in the consultation document, there's some talk about how many valuations you would expect to see between breaches. One thing to note on that is, obviously, if it says there will be 10 valuations between a breach, it is possible that at the next valuation, depending on the assumptions, there could be a breach even with a wider corridor. It's just about the likelihood overall on every single valuation if there would be a breach, and lots of fluctuations. Craig, your hand went up.
Thanks, Robert. Just a quick one on that. So that seems to be an average. So that being on average, if they make the first two proposals, we may expect to see a breach once every 40 years or so, every 10 valuations. That seems to be a bit of an average figure across the public sector. Is it fair to say that with the more expensive schemes like fire and a fixed corridor of 2% or 3%, all things equal, you'd expect fire to breach more than other schemes, so say teachers, NHS?
Yes, that's a good point, and I believe it's covered in the consultation where they talk about proportional corridors. So yeah, there is an inherent thing that 2% of fire is less than the same percentage of the employer contribution rate than for also the rate than it is for the other schemes which have a lower cost. So yeah, there is an element there that the same changes to assumptions leading to the same proportional shift in the same numerical shift in the cost cap will lead to a proportionally higher shift in. Oh yeah, so yeah, you are correct essentially that fire, because of the larger cost, 2% is worth less as a proportion of that cost, so you might be more likely to breach. But then there's elements behind that. Treasury's, I can't speak for Treasury's thinking, but having proportional corridors could lead to the opposite, where the movement is the same numerically, but you get different results. So either way you go with proportion or a fixed numerical, there will be winners and losers essentially in that result, if that makes sense. But yeah, you are correct that fire is one of the harder hit by smaller changes proportionally.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sam, you go.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think that in the consultation they said that they thought that it'd be very complex and difficult for people to understand if there were different corridors for different schemes. I guess really what you need to weigh up there is whether it's the stability and the not breaching the corridor, or so you might argue, well, should we not have a 5% corridor or something like that for fire? But then would you be happy with the situation where, say, there was a 3% change in cost across all of the schemes, and for NHS teachers, civil service, they're all seeing benefit improvements to their members, but your members aren't seeing any benefit improvements because your corridor's 5% as a fixed proportion. So that might be a bit of a thing to weigh up.
And so just a reduction or an increase, isn't it? As to how to think about it.
Yeah. Just considering stability and what we mean by long-term stability, and we've talked about, breaching not for 40 years. Are we suggesting then that we won't see the schemes amended for 40 years? Because that feels like that's, do we need to be thinking about that in the round? Because are these schemes really going to stay unamended now for the next 40 years? What do we actually mean by stability? What is the actual likelihood of the outcome of this?
So obviously this just looks in the possibility of a breach under the mechanism of the cost cap. It doesn't take into account any voluntary changes to the schemes based around any future policy decisions within those who can make those policy decisions. So this is just from a purely mechanical standpoint that, and as I said before, you might see one even under the new potentially wider corridor or whatever Treasury land on, you could see a breach at the first valuation. There's lots of underlying factors that go in there, but yeah, the main thing is this is just changes that are required under the cost cap mechanism and the cost cap regulations. Any voluntary changes to the scheme because of other elements that might come in, changes to workforce, for example, or just policy decision changes amongst those who can make them, might change the scheme at any other time going forwards.
Thank you. One of the concerns we have is that if you widen the window, the corridor, then what might actually happen at that stage is that you get bigger changes, and how do you actually prepare people for that large change? Has any modelling been done on how much difference it might make? If say that the corridor went from 2% to 3% to the changes that ultimately might happen, and are there corrective mechanisms that could be used, such as spreading methodology, I guess, or those types of things that could actually mean that people weren't facing a draconian either cut in benefits or a massive sort of windfall, which, and intergenerational fairness obviously comes into that.
That is true, and I believe that's one of the questions that will be answered at the Q&A that came out of the webinar last week. I think there was a question around smoothing and intergenerational fairness. So if that's okay, I would like to postpone a full answer on that until that is formally sorted.
You're welcome to do so, but it was actually asked by one of the fire SAB, and I think Martin Clark gave quite a negative answer at the actual meeting, suggesting that it wasn't going to be looked at. But it would seem to me that if member value is one of the measures that needs to be used, then actually more work is needed to actually look at what is the impact of these changes on the members.
That's true, and that's something to raise again through the Treasury.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. But no, especially if that's a serious concern, which it could be for having the less frequent but more abrupt changes to benefits, that's definitely something Treasury would like to hear about, but it's important that you tell Treasury about.
Yeah, and then you can do some modelling to show whether it is a real concern or not. Is all, because you can see that it's hard to think through, I think. Sam, you're on mute.
Sorry, everyone. I think on the back of the work that we did for the preliminary results of the 2016 valuation, you can get an idea of the level of change of benefits. It was more like a 5% breach that I think we ended up with there, but you could see the impact that had on the expected change that might be needed to the accrual rate. So that could at least help to put it into context to some degree without needing to do any numbers. Of course, we can do some numbers if you'd like us to. Always happy to tinker around with some numbers. But that would, if you went for 3/5 of that change, that would be, a bit of a broad brush idea to give you an indication. What does 3% actually mean in terms of the benefit change that could follow?
But had it been, it's a question of how it occurs as well, and sort of modelling it from one valuation to another, I feel.
Yeah, I'm sure there is some, it all comes into the round, and how many people have you got left in the scheme to pay these things off over, and all those, but things do change from valuation to valuation. That's definite, yeah.
Thanks, Sam. So yeah, I was just going to move on to the last slide I had, looking at the time, and basically these just set out the 7 questions that were asked on both. I've gone through most of the discount rate ones. So on the cost control, it's about just asking around the suggestions around widening the corridor, the using only the reform scheme, the proposal to introduce an economic check. One last point on that is, obviously, if an economic check is brought in, that then kind of brings both of these consultations together almost, because the economic check is very likely to include something on discount rate, and therefore these consultations do go slightly hand in hand once that potential aspect comes in. And then the later questions talk about, if there is an economic check, should the scape rate be used for that, and what changes to the scape rate would have a potential impact. So there's and then again there's a talk on inequalities as well. So those are the 7 direct questions that Treasury are asking for respondents on. And obviously, as you'll be aware, the consultations are open until the 19th of August, and I think you guys have I think it's next week, your meeting with Treasury to bring up any of your concerns, and just let me see if there's anything. Yeah, so that was the end of what I was going to speak of. Is there any additional question? I think we covered up all the questions just before I got to the end, so I'll stop sharing, but happy to take any more questions, and we'll be around for the rest of the meeting, pick up anything if required.
The scape discount rate changes and how that might feed into an economic check. I think the government actually suggested that if it changed to an STPR rate, that might then mean that a different rate was needed. Yet they're calling it an economic check, and my understanding is that STPR is part of an economic appraisal. So I'm not sure I follow the logic on that. I wondered if you knew what had been behind the government actuaries sort of report on that one. I appreciate it's a different team, and what you think about if we move to a social time preference rate, whether that makes it more or less likely that an economic check is going to be needed.
Well, I think if we are using the STPR and we're in this world where STPR isn't really being reviewed very, very frequently, then it might be, it could be that inflation was the thing that has led to, oh no, inflation can't, because that's an immune thing. But I guess it's one of the other items might have caused the trigger, and we just want to be sure that we aren't hitting employers with a double whammy, or hitting members with a double whammy of reducing benefits at the same time that it's easier for the economy to afford pension provision. So So I think the suggestion in the report that we might need to decouple from the scape rate and look to a GDPR measure again when considering affordability is this harking back to the trying to look at the tax base and trying to look at, you know, the affordability in terms of the tax streams that are expected to be coming in and helping to pay for these benefits that are being provided from the schemes.
So using the GDPR check for the cost cap mechanism as a whole, not just an economic element of it, as it were.
So I don't think there's a suggestion that you wouldn't use STPR for doing the calculations under the cost cap mechanism, you know, to come up with the values, the employer contribution rates and things like that. I think from my reading, I think we would be using the same discount rate to do both setting the employer contribution rate and also determining costs under the cost cap mechanism. But of course, the discount rate is, you know, kind of taken out when we're considering the ceiling and the floor. So it does have an impact. Obviously, if you've got a really high discount rate, what if longevity was to increase massively, then you have a lower impact coming into your cost cap calculations than if you've got a lower discount rate. So, you know, it does have some bearing, but it's not quite as significant as it is in the employer contribution rate. But I think it's just in that check at the end where we're saying, oh, well, actually, there's been a breach one way or the other. But does this make sense in the context of the affordability to the economy? Can we, you know, is it sensible to either increase or reduce benefits? And I think that then saying, well, when we're doing this assessment, STPR, does that make sense? You know, this is a rate that's being used to evaluate long-term, you know, government projects within government. It's not really linked to the, you know, the same kind of real-time measures that the GDP is.
Are there any other questions, Alex?
Yeah, it's just me. I guess the economic check, I think it probably makes sense as some sort of sense check, as Sam says, and as some sort of safety mechanism almost. But of course, the problem is that it just lacks a little bit of transparency. But I suppose that's the very nature of it, because you're not quite sure which levers you need to pull at which particular stage.
But I think the intention is that it would be transparent, and I think that it would be set out in the directions to say this is how it is done. I don't think that the intention is, you know, this would be, well, there will be an economic check and no one knows what it is until we get to such time, and we'll make it up on the spot to get the answer that we want. I think the idea is that we say there is an economic check, and I expect that would be detailed to say, well, this is what the economic check is. I don't have an insider track from Treasury on that, but that's, you know, that's how I read it. That's how I envisage it playing out.
Are there any other flexibilities that you think might help in that? We don't want another failing cost cap mechanism, you know, and clearly it would help if we could pick up what might go wrong with it. And they rejected, obviously, the idea of a further sort of sense check, and that's not been consulted upon. Yeah,
because I think that landed on seeming to be too open to
manipulation.
Yeah, well, speculation that, you know, people have been bribed to come up with whatever they come up with. So yeah, I think the, you know, going for this kind of still a mechanistic approach to try and, you know, just put something in there that's very, very clear and very transparent. And I think the government actuary in his report did suggest a few other things. You know, there was stuff around smoothing. The government have said that they'll think about longevity smoothing further down the line, which is important for the uniform schemes where we don't have that same link between SPA and NPA. So yeah, I think definitely, if you've only read the consultation from Treasury, I think it's also worth looking at the government actuary's review as well, because it does have, you know, other things that he thought about in there.
Okay, thank you very much. That's extremely helpful. Are you leaving us at this particular point?
It's up to you. If you'd like us to leave, we can leave, or we can stay.
I'm happy for them to stay. I don't think we're.
First actuarial are going to go on with their paper. Would you rather just have the SAB board, Craig, at this point?
I'm happy to be directed by you, Claire and Joanne. So I put the ball back in your court. Well, I'm easy either way.
I'm happy to be transparent.
Okay, transparency being a good principle that we've been discussing, we're happy to have you stay and answer questions. Yep, thank you. Can I turn to you then now, Craig, to take us through your briefing on it?
Yeah, thanks, John. And just a quick question, I guess. So we obviously prepared the initial set of slides for the subcommittee last week, most of which was being covered by Gad's presentation. So in terms of kind of making this most effective use of time, is it worth me going through that, picking out some bits that maybe weren't covered by Gad, and then picking up that summary note? I can see Roger nodding.
I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So, technology check, can you all see my slides in some form or another?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So I'll, for the benefit of people who weren't at the subcommittee meeting last week, what I'll do is I'll just go through the presentation we talk through, fairly high level, but just pick on some of the points that weren't necessarily covered by Gad's presentation. So I guess anyone who wants to stop me as we go through, please do, and then we'll kind of take it from there. So, as we know, Treasury have issued 2 consultations issuing all public service schemes, not just fire. So these are on changes to the cost control mechanism and the discount rate methodology. And the SAB as a group needs to decide how, well, if and how we respond to these consultations. So confusingly, these are in a different order than Gad's slide. So I'll start with the cost control mechanism, and then we'll go on to the escape rate. So, as we know, Government Actuary published his review into the cost control mechanism back in May this year, and there was a number of recommendations for change. Treasury picked up on a few of those and are now consulting on them. In terms of the objectives, the original policy objectives were these 3 on the blue, highlighted in blue on the left. So these were maintain the value of the scheme to members, providing stability and certainty to benefit levels, and protecting the taxpayer from unforeseen costs. So there's a bit of an asterisk there next to value, in that that's a little bit of an undefined term. Is that pound of pension they earn a year? Is that pound of pension they expect to receive over their expected lifetime? But nonetheless, that is the objective. Now, Government Actuary was also asked to look at 2 other things, as we know. So these are the effect on intergenerational unfairness or fairness, and the government's ability to respond to future developments. In terms of whether the cost cap met the objectives, these are kind of our starters for 10 in terms of whether we think it met the objective. These aren't taken from the consultation or from Gad's report. So initially, there was a cost cap floor breach because members' pay wasn't going up as fast as we thought it would be, and members' life expectancy wasn't improving as fast as we thought it would be. So on that basis, we think it did meet the objective of maintaining some level of value to members, which did allow government to respond to future developments. But with all public service schemes breaching on the first valuation, we would argue that it didn't provide stability and certainty to benefit levels. And then with the perverse outcomes that was mentioned in Gad's report and the Treasury consultation of benefit improvements coming at the same time as increases to employer costs, we'd argue that maybe it didn't protect taxpayer from any unforeseen costs. There's also a bit of a question on whether it's intergenerationally fair. That comes from the fact that around 2/3 of the breach arose from costs arising from legacy scheme benefits, whereas rectification of the breach is made to reform scheme benefits. So that mismatch that I think Robert picked up earlier on in the presentation. So if we just have a little look at what actually is assessed in the cost cap. Currently, what is included are past service costs in both the reformed and legacy schemes, plus future service costs for active members in the reform scheme. What we call member experience, so these are things as mortality experience, pay increases, and other things such as whether members withdraw from the scheme before retirement, whether they take early retirement and give up pension for cash. We now know that included as a member cost is McLeod. What is excluded from the cost cap calculation currently are any past service costs from the legacy schemes arising from non-active members. And also crucially changes to or technical changes, so changes to the discount rate, changes to long-term price inflation, and changes to any actuarial methodology, so changes in how GAD do the calculations. If we just have a little recap of what happened in 2016, there was a target cost cap set of 16.8%. There's that 2% corridor that we all know and love, that if cost increase or decreases within this 2% band, no change is required. The initial results showed that there'd been quite a material floor breach of 5.2% outside of the corridor. So if things had gone as we expected them to, that would be remedied by an improvement to member benefits. Then along came McLeod, so quite a material impact of McLeod in the fire schemes, more so than in the other public service schemes, just mainly due to the design of the older fire schemes being relatively expensive. Adding those blocks together, we get quite a material breach, ceiling breach of around 15% or so, doing some quick maths there. The results of that valuation were that breach would be waived, so there wouldn't be any benefit reductions arising from McLeod. That was the same across all public service schemes. Again, this is a little bit of the rationale for change. I won't spend any time on this because Robert and Samantha covered that earlier on, but essentially all the schemes breached quite materially at the first valuation for reasons that weren't necessarily unexpected, extraordinary events. What did the government actually recommend? So we recommended two stages of recommendations. The first, stage one, were changes to the mechanism itself. So these included things as, do we keep things as they are? Do we just look at future service only in the reform scheme? Or do we do something in between, where we look at all service, past and future in the reform schemes, but we don't include legacy schemes? And do we tweak the corridor? Do we make it a bit bigger, make it a bit harder to breach? The second set of recommendation was including or introducing some kind of validation of the result. And as we know, these included what the government actually called an affordability offset assessment, the Treasury have now coined an economic check, and or a review of the breach by maybe a third party set of representatives or the government themselves. The three taken forward by Treasury are highlighted in red. So again, these are the three that Robert and Samantha talked through earlier on. I'm talking through this fairly fast because it is covering a lot of ground that we have talked about. But if any of the group wants me to kind of just sort of go back over things, please do put your hand up or shout out. Just coming back to the economic check to explain what exactly that is, because it's not straightforward, or it wasn't to me the first 2-3 times I read it. But essentially, changes to escape rate can't cause or increase a breach to the cost cap, but they can reduce or offset it. So if we look at the first slide on the left-hand side, if, for example, the initial results of the cost cap breach was a floor breach of 5%, then adding on the impact of a change in discount rate worsened that by a further 1% to 6%, then the final result that would need rectifying would be that original 5% figure, because changes to escape can't cause a breach on their own, or they can't make a breach worse. What they can do is offset, reduce, or totally remove a breach. So coming to the chart on the right hand side, Same initial result in that we have a floor breach of 5%, but the impact of allowing for escape is that costs have increased by 3.5%. Adding those two together, you get a breach of 1.5%, which in this example is still within the corridor of 2% using these large in Treasury, meaning that there's no floor breach and there's no rectification to benefits. The same will be true if there were ceiling breaches instead of floor breaches. I've just used 2 out of the 8 slides that were in the consultation. Does that make sense? Because it took me a few times to go over that and it wasn't immediately clear, but I'm not hearing anyone putting their hands up, so maybe you got it quicker than I did, so I'll move on. So what are the impact of these on the members and the employers? So looking at the first one, the impact of moving to a reform scheme only. Initially, it probably reduces intergenerational unfairness. So it does align to a degree the benefits that cause the breach to the benefits that are rectified by the breach, and would expect fewer changes over the short to medium term. Over the longer term, there'll obviously be more and more past service relating to former members of the reform scheme. So the comments here aren't necessarily going to hold true forevermore, but in the short to medium term, it probably does reduce intergenerational unfairness. From the employer's point of view, any costs or savings that arise from the legacy schemes are borne by employers / the taxpayer. They're not impacting on member benefits. Ultimately, the impact of widening the corridor is that we'd expect fewer changes, but when those changes do occur, when those breaches do occur, they'll be larger. So from the member's point of view, fewer changes, but larger changes to benefits if they do occur. From the employer's point of view, a wider corridor means larger costs can creep in without any remedial action, or vice versa, a larger reduction in costs can creep in before any remedial action is taken. Economic check, ultimately this will mean fewer benefit changes, and it does also mean that decisions by Treasury that increase employer costs can offset any changes that occur when the value to members is falling. From the employer's point of view, ultimately this will be more stable costs and could prevent this perverse outcome that has been mentioned a few times in the consultation and GAD's review. What's not in the consultation, Robert alluded to this earlier, is that GAD did mention the possibility of a scheme-specific corridor. So just to explain what this is, public service schemes cost different amounts to provide. Fire is relatively expensive, around 30% of pay or so in total. Taking the bottom of the pile, teachers, that's relatively less expensive at 20%. So if the overall costs of the teacher scheme increased by 10%, that would be a 2 percentage point increase in the overall costs. The overall cost of fire only have to increase by 7%. So 7% of 30 is just a shade over 2%. So the point here is that the more expensive schemes with a fixed corridor are more likely to breach, all things being equal. Treasury's view that having a scheme-specific corridor would be more complex and difficult to understand, and they alluded to potential unfairness between scheme members. After hearing GAD's presentation earlier, I think what they were alluding to there was, say for example, there was a 2.5% breach across all schemes, for example, and we had a scheme-specific corridor, then it could be the case that teachers, for example, get a benefit improvement or worsening, whereas members of fire don't necessarily. So that's one thing we just wanted to flag that wasn't in the consultation. Nikki, I can see you've got your hand up.
Oh yeah. Can I just ask, you know, you say 6%, 2%. Could you give me an idea on like an average salary? How much extra are we talking? Would that be possible? You know, because I know we're talking about a big fire authority or whatever, but as an individual, you know, how much would that cost?
So what would that cost the member themselves, or what would that cost the employer? Sorry.
The member. So
this wouldn't, breaches that arise from, say, and again, if I'm getting any of this wrong, my colleagues from GAD can correct me. But these breaches, they're not passed on to the members necessarily by an increase or decrease in contributions. The default is that if the corridor breaches, unless anything else is agreed, then the default is that the accrual rate, so the rate at which members build up pension in the scheme, either improves or worsens. So there wouldn't be a knock-on effect to the member in terms of, we're asking you for an extra 2% of pay, or we're knocking 2% off your contributions.
Right. Okay.
So this is just, while we're talking about percent of pay in terms of the cost of the scheme, the impact of that is that the cost of the scheme is either reduced or increased in terms of the benefits that members are building up, rather than any sort of savings or costs being passed on to the members via contributions.
And it's worth probably, Sam reminded me that we've already been through that exercise once, and that, was it 5% translated to a change in accrual rate from 60th to 50, whatever it. I wasn't around at that stage, so I'm going to look to someone else to actually say what the percentage was going to be.
It was just under 60th to about 40, sort of 51.7. I think I quickly checked that, but 51.2 or something like that was the kind of the quantum of that change. I had a quick search in my files as Sam was speaking. So
yeah, I think the comment I was going to make on this really was it's the impact on employers, and of course what we've always got to be mindful of is that if Her Majesty's Treasury do not adequately compensate the particular fire grant, then obviously that hits our bottom line, and therefore there is less money, you know, to pay in the basic revenue and running of the fire authority. So I think that's the thing, particularly whichever side you're on, you've also got to recognise that's the other big risk.
Again, this slide just picks up on, and again, there's something Robert mentioned earlier, that one of the proposals from Government Actuary was that there'd be this secondary review of the breach to see whether it's essentially sensible or sort of appropriate or not. Treasury's view in the consultation is that they'd rather have the cost control mechanism as a purely technical mechanism, rather than having this sort of additional layer of subjectivity involved. So we'll come back to the questions in a second in a second summary document. Second set of slides is just picking up on the items that Robert and Sam covered initially, which are the changes to the SCAPE discount rate. So again, these are mainly used to set employer contributions across the public service schemes. We have a slightly wider application in fire, in that mainly in the 92 scheme, they're used currently to set commutation factors. It's currently 2.4% above inflation. This is reviewed regularly. There's essentially a large review every 10 years, a smaller review in the 5-year period in between. And in 2018, we saw a bit of an ad hoc review. This is maybe a bit of a interesting or important slide that we pulled out. The original objectives in 2011 are set out on the left-hand side, and the two that were prioritised in that review were that the SCAPE rate, the discount rate, should give a fair reflection of the costs of the scheme and also reflect the future risk to government income. The objectives for this review are on the right. A slightly wordy objective of supporting the plurality of public service provision of public services has gone, which I'm not too sad about because I don't have to say it again. But interestingly, the transparent and simple objective is missing from the 2021 review. The clear priority for the current review is stability, with an equal weighting given to the first two. Again, this is highlighting bits that Robert's gone through. The discount rate has been reduced twice since 2011, including an out-of-cycle review. The GDP projections are currently set by the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OER. Treasury currently prescribe the social time preference rate, which has been hasn't really changed at all in the last 20 years or so. It's a lot more stable. So consultation, what's it asking? It's asking for views on 2 approaches for setting the scape discount rate. So retaining the current approach of GDP, maybe with a couple of tweaks. So maybe allowing for slightly different rates at different terms, or maybe allowing for actual experience over the intervaluation period, or aligning this with the social time preference rate, again, potentially with some tweaks. So the tweaks here, as Robert alluded to, is that the current social time preference rate is around 3.5% above price inflation, and that compares to the current GDP-based scape rates of 2.4%. The main tweak that's not necessarily suggested but alluded to in the Treasury consultation is that they could essentially knock an element of that, reduce it a bit to remove this catastrophic risk element, which basically brings it in line with the current rate of 2.4%. This is just highlighting how the social time preference rate is set. Again, we've covered this in Robert's presentation earlier. How has it changed? Again, this is picking up bits from Robert's presentation earlier. Again, it used to be in line, scape rate used to be set in line with the social time preference rate before 2011 at that 3.5% of price inflation. The last major review in 2011 aligned it with GDP, as we talked about, as a potentially a better measure for how the tax base will increase. That was at the time set at 3% of price inflation. Subsequent reductions have brought it down to where we are now, which is 2.4% above. Where will this go in the future? Well, if nothing's done and they continue to use the current approach, that would fall based on current projections to around 1.8% above price inflation. So that would increase, going back to a question I think Des asked earlier, that would increase cost by maybe over 20% of payroll, that 0.6% drop. So quite a material difference if nothing is done. Again, this is a summary of the proposals. Features of using long-term GDP growth is it's a proxy for future tax revenue, which is essentially where this money is going to be coming from. It's set by the OBR rather than Treasury, so there's potentially more transparency there. But potential negatives of this approach is that it's not been stable in the last 10 years, so it does lead to quite big jumps in the employer contribution rate. Features of the social time preference rate, or the STPR, is that the pensions are essentially a form of investment for the government, putting money aside now for, well, not essentially a form of investment for the government. So there's an argument there that you could value them consistently with other major public spending products. It's been unchanged since 2003. That's no guarantee that it will continue to be unchanged in its current form, but it has been unchanged for the last 20 years or so. So it is much more stable, but it is arguably less commonly understood. And obviously Treasury have arguably greater control in setting that rate, and then setting the scape discount rate. Impact on employers, all things being equal, a lower discount rate means higher costs. Again, all things equal, doing a lot of heavy work there, but ultimately, the most influential assumption in evaluation is the discount rate. So no amount of tinkering around the edge in terms of the other assumptions is going to offset any material change in the discount rate. Employee contribution rates are due to change in April 24, so a year later than they were originally planned, due to implications of allowance for McLeod in the 2016 and 2020 valuations. So there's no direct impact on members in terms of the benefits they're building up by a change in the discount rate, but there are potentially direct and indirect effects, other direct and indirect effects that come through. So the scape rate feeds into early and late retirement factors, commutation factors, and it also feeds through into the interaction with the cost cap if the economic check sort of carries on in its proposed form. Another potential consequence is that if, as Roger alluded to, if HMRs, if employers aren't given additional funding for increased contributions, then that would ultimately lead to cost pressures across FRAs. We'll come on to the questions shortly, but in terms of next steps, we've got a SAB meeting today. Consultation response is about 4 weeks or so away, so we have a bit of time to sort of put together a response and think about how, as a group, we respond to that, what form our response takes, and kind of the tone we want to set. Okay, so Roger, Joanne, we've obviously got the summary document sort of highlighting some of the discussions we had at the meeting last week. Is it worth sort of kind of, I mean, I'm happy to take sort of guidance from you two in how you want to do this, but is it worth picking up this and addressing the questions in turn? Is that a sensible way to do this?
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, because what we did was we went through the questions and came up with a suggested summary. I mean, some of the things, of course, we would all be in this. I think we were all virtually on the same page, but it was some of us were on the same paragraph. Things like changing the valuation cycle to the discount rate to match the valuation cycle was eminently sensible. But there, and everyone wants stability, but there were some other issues that were a little more diverse. So yeah, happy, Craig, for you to take through it.
It might make sense, Craig, as we're going through it, we've got sort of discussion on the agenda. If people start sort of asking questions about it and the discussion process starts as we go through it, I guess it probably mean that you don't need just quite as much of a drink of water as well.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds sensible. So first consultation I'm picking up here is the cost cap. So proposed changes to the cost control mechanism. Question 1 is that essentially, do we agree that a reform scheme only design is a right balance of risk between scheme members and the taxpayer? So as a reminder of what this is, the current cost control mechanism allows for costs arising from both 2015 scheme benefits, but also 92 and 06 scheme benefits for those current active members. So there's arguably a bit of a disconnect there in terms of where the costs are arising from and where those costs are then remedied, in that it's typically the members with legacy scheme benefits are typically older members, whereas the members who will see their benefits remedied going forward are typically younger members. So one suggestion put forward by GAD was that we'll just base this on the 2015 scheme only and just look at future service. But the argument sort of against that by Treasury was that leaves a lot of costs, so all past service costs essentially, that the taxpayer will be on the hook for. So GAD Treasury have essentially gone for a middle option where they said we'll ignore costs arising from the legacy scheme, but will allow for all past and future service costs arising from the reform scheme. So reform scheme only, but allow for past and future costs. And that was their balance of essentially putting an equal amount of costs on the taxpayer and the scheme member. So things that we talked about at the meeting, there's a couple of things to think about here. Is the getting a stable mechanism and balancing the risk between members and taxpayers are kind of competing objectives. So if we went for a reform scheme design only and just looked at future service, that would introduce a lot more stability in the mechanism, but would also pass a lot more cost potentially onto the taxpayer. Current mechanism, less stability because you've got a lot of costs arising from past service in the legacy schemes. So less stability, but more protection for the taxpayer. Proposed option, arguably somewhere in the middle in terms of meeting those two objectives. It could potentially be seen as fairer, moving to reform scheme design only, because you are aligning the two features in terms of the costs arising from the scheme and the scheme that the benefits are remedied are the same, but there is essentially a trade-off between the two. And the penultimate bullet point there on the that I'm sharing is just making the note that over time the stability will arguably reduce, in the past service aspect of the reform scheme will make up a bigger and bigger proportion of the cost as these schemes will build up more and more past service. So I'll pause there for breath and just see if there's any immediate questions. I can see Nikki's got your hand up, but I don't know if that's an old hand from earlier. I assume that was an old hand from earlier. Okay, no comments on that. I mean,
does that mean then that if we were to, in our response to actually say that, it can be seen as a compromise and we don't have any objections to it, is that something that the SAB can support?
Yeah, I think we can.
Sounded like it.
Okay, second two questions are related, so we'll take those together. This is essentially, do we agree with government's intention to widen the corridor? And do we think a corridor of 3% is appropriate? If not, why not? So again, just recapping on what this means. All things equal, a wider corridor will mean fewer breaches, but when those breaches do occur, they'll be larger. A wider corridor also means that there's costs have more scope to drift, whether that's up or down, before remedial action is taken. There are practical issues to consider that aren't touched on in consultation that are applicable to the fire scheme more than others. So the first of those is administration. From the administrator's point of view and also from the member's point of view, regular changes aren't necessarily going to be welcomed. They definitely won't be welcomed by the administrators when they have to recode the system every 4 years. And from the member's point of view, retirement planning or relying on figures from annual benefit statements can prove difficult if those projections are worthless in 4 years' time because the accrual rate's changed. One thing we did mention is that there's an argument that a fixed corridor means that more expensive schemes are more likely to breach. So there's a question of whether a proportional corridor is more appropriate. So say if costs increase by 10% or 15% overall, rather than just this 2 percentage points or 3 percentage point breach in the corridor. There's a note in the consultation Treasury that the government is concerned that wider corridors for some schemes may benefit members over others. We weren't entirely sure what they meant by that. So one clarification we were going to put in the proposal is just on that point. There's also a question. So if the two proposals go ahead, there's a expected breach maybe once every 40 years, so 10 valuation cycles. Okay, maybe slightly less in some schemes, slightly more in schemes like fire. So there's a question that we talked about, which could be viewed two ways. The first way that I've written down there is essentially if we have an economic check being introduced to kind of add a bit of stability to the system, do we need to widen the corridor? And I guess kind of the devil's advocate version of that is if we're widening the corridor and having an expected breach every 40 years, do we need to introduce an economic check? So that's one thing that we talked through a few times. We didn't get to a consensus on that. I think it was more this was a question we were going to put back to Treasury rather than one that we were going to agree or disagree with. And then there's also the question of whether if we do have a widened corridor, which means more severe benefit changes, do we introduce some kind of smoothing? That would bring with it, I think, what would potentially bring with it some intergenerationally fair issues to consider. So if benefits need a significant improvement straight away, should we be smoothing that and phasing that in and vice versa? But if we are going to proceed with a larger corridor, which would mean larger benefit changes, is there an argument there to bring in some smoothing over time rather than sort of have members see that cliff edge on day one? Des, I can see your hand's gone up. Yeah,
thanks very much, Craig. Has there been any modelling done that if the corridor was 3% and these are the other factors plugged in, whether there's likely to be breaches and what the impact would be? So has there been a lot of, is that too complex to do that modelling going forward?
So we've not done any modelling on that. There, I mean, going back to the 2016 valuation, ignoring McLeod, we still would have breached the 3% corridor quite materially. Looking at the reasons for that breach overall, a large proportion of that came from past service costs. So overall, there's a lesser expectation that there will be breaches going forward. Have we, as First Actuarial, done any in-depth modelling on that? No, we've not. Or
is it because past service costs will become more known unless there's because the 1992 scheme, no more people are joining it. So and we know the numbers and they'll be going down. So it seems to me that it is possible to do some modelling. I'm just wondering whether it's in anyone is looking at doing it, because we've been asked questions here without any indication of what it potentially could look like. I don't know whether if I was happy to increase the corridor to 3%, what are the types of things that might impact on it and when might it happen? I mean, I'd like to see that. With any of these options, and the thing about the economic check, the first thing is I'd like to know what are the factors that will be plugged by Treasury that will be plugged into the economic check. I'd like to know that before I comment on whether or not I think an economic check's a good idea. So that we've been asked to do these to respond to a consultation with really not enough information on which to make an informed judgment, in my view.
Just going back on that first, there has been modelling done by GAD in their initial review that I've not got to hand, but we can share in terms of the factors that would lead to a breach or wouldn't lead to a breach. So that modelling has been done. I can share that with the group. In terms of the second question on the economic check, the proposal is that the two things that will feed into that, the main one is changes in potentially changes in escape discount rate or another measure if the escape discount rate is changed. So the way I read that is it's essentially escape discount rate or maybe a GDP based measure if escape moves away from GDP. The second one is earnings assumption. So for some schemes, it's not entirely clear. That may impact the fire scheme more than others because there is a link to earnings in the in-service evaluation for the care schemes. I think the main factor that's going to feed into that economic check will be this either the escape rate or the GDP based approach, depending on where the escape rate goes.
Roger.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the word smoothing sounds very similar to stable. Because we like to be special in the LGPS, we have our own cost management process as well as the Treasury's, because we like to be completely difficult. And so there we have a policy of could and should within the 2% target range, and that's usually if something goes above 1%, so that there is some minor adjustments. So I think, and it'd be interesting to tease out with the Home Office how they feel about this, because this is basically about the smoothing and more stability of the scheme. And I always believe actually it's about the integrity of the scheme as well, rather than having less blunt shocks. The other thing was a comment that Helen made at our meeting, which was about that these breaches that might occur might be particularly impact on just a small group of people, but they would be a big impact. I think that was the other thing that I can remember from last week, but I don't know whether Helen wants to reaffirm that.
Yeah, I think it was just you know, in terms of when that breach might occur and the changes to the scheme happen. If you widen the corridor and therefore have a much bigger impact when that breach happens, then kind of you've got a lot of people who have possibly get real minimal impact from it because they've been in the scheme for long and they're approaching the retirement, and therefore people who have been in the scheme for a shorter period and therefore their personal impacts on the change isn't big actually gets a bigger impact on their benefits, and you know, it's where that balance lies, and obviously if the change is an increase in benefits, then they'll all be extremely happy, but you know, we have to bear in mind that the chances of the benefit, you know, the chances of the benefits getting better are just as or getting worse are just as strong. So, you know, it's affecting a disproportionate amount of somebody's total pension dependent on when it happens in the process. And so the wider corridor brings all that into play.
I think some of this touches on what we were discussing before and the need for perhaps a better understanding of how it might impact this idea of getting sort of bigger changes occasionally. And I think, you know, we don't have to answer every single question. You know, on this one, what we can say is that we think that more modelling is needed before actually working out what the fair or, you know, what the appropriate response is to this particular question. And this is what we would suggest. I don't know how people feel about that as a suggestion for our response. Should I take silence as agreement to it, or do people want to reserve their position on it? I think certainly there are some principles which, you know, which is that you can't lose the intergenerational fairness in this mechanism, and we need to be careful about that, and more thought is needed, I guess. Do you want to press on?
Yeah. So, I mean, we started to cover this a little bit, but the next three questions in the proposal are essentially on the economic check. So, sort of whether we agree with the proposal to introduce a check, do we think the current SCAPE discount rate as it stands, so based on GDP, is an appropriate economic measure or appropriate thing to feed in to do the check? And following on from that, if SCAPE changes to be based on something other than GDP, what do you think should be used? Continue to use GDP, or should an alternate measure be used? So just the kind of the high level points we discussed about this, the key theme from both the GAD review and the consultation is that the idea behind this economic check is to prevent what they've coined a perverse outcome. So essentially member benefits improving at the same time that employer costs are going up. So as a reminder, the impact of the SCAPE rate or whatever economic check is used can reduce or remove a breach, but it can't make a breach worse, and it can't cause a breach on its own. So this is quite a fundamental change. The first two proposals, so whether it's widening the corridor or whether it's changing which elements of the scheme the cost control mechanism looks at, are more tweaks to the existing mechanism, whereas introducing an element of technical change into the mechanism is arguably slightly more of a fundamental change than the first two. If this had been in place in 2016, it would have the change in SCAPE would have offset the floor breach and no benefits would have improved. a point Joanne's made a couple of times, and I think Joanne, you made this at the call, the GAD's presentation last week, is that there's a lack of discussion about member value and what that means, and potentially that's something we could draw out in our consultation response. The another thing we talked about at the cost effectiveness subcommittee is that it did seem sensible to have a consistency between the scape rate and the measure used in any economic check. And I guess I was just thinking about the discussion we had on this earlier. Ultimately, this boils down to what is the purpose of this economic check? Is it to prevent perverse outcomes? And by perverse outcomes, I mean benefits improving when employer contributions are going up, or vice versa. Well, if that's the intention of this mechanism, then it does, I think, in my mind, seem sensible to align the economic check with the scape discount rate. But if the outcome is it's been kind of talked about in the government action presentation last week, we're not going to improve benefits when the economy can't afford it, when the taxpayers can't afford it, or vice versa. We're not going to worsen benefits when the taxpayer can afford to pay them. Then there's maybe an argument to align the economic check with a more GDP based approach rather than scape. But it does seem that this has kind of dawned on me over the last since we had the subcommittee meeting last week, is that there's potentially two different objectives being put out here for the economic check. I'm conscious, Joanne and Roger, that's the first time you've heard me say that. So I just wondered if you agreed. It does seem that there's maybe two, not necessarily competing objectives, but two different objectives here, and it's it's not entirely clear which is the primary one for the economic check.
I would agree with that.
Yes, great.
So I guess any initial thoughts from the board? I suspect it may not be that we all want to put pen and paper down and we say we agree necessarily with the economic check, but I may be proved wrong. So any initial thoughts on that, either the question specifically or kind of the general tone of how we respond on these three sections?
Any sort of Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I mean, from our point of view, it's clearly a lot of information that's come to us that we're still trying to digest. We weren't at the subcommittee last week, and clearly the people that were there have been cogitating over that over the last few days and working it out, and we're clearly a little bit behind. But in terms of a direction or agreeing anything, I think we would need to have a closer look at and straighten out our thoughts before committing to anything here. Today's been useful for gathering information. I think as a sort of initial overview, my own personal view on the economic check is one of caution, really, because there seems to be a lack of clarity about how that would be done. The transparency doesn't seem to be there. It has a subjective view admitted that'll be applied to it. So we certainly need to know more about that before making any type of commitment. In terms of the widening of the corridor, it seems to me to be a straightforward choice between the risk, severity, likelihood type of scenario. And I do wonder, well, a question on that particular thing between valuations, the potential to be able to
to make adjustments between valuations to try and offset. I would like to know if that was possible, or if that is would be able to be built in, or do we have to wait for a valuation to make those considerations? And just finally from me, on the reform scheme only, clearly that does seem to make sense, but I would like to have more information regarding the difference between the past and future costs and the future costs only, and know what the difference between those on, because there certainly seems to be an impact on the member implied in the documentation we've got there, but it's not made clear what that is. So I think we need to have a closer look at things, Joanne, before we make any commitment to stuff. And just finally on that, in terms of the consultation itself, 8 weeks during the summer is not easy, and I do appreciate that, but leaving here with an idea of how we continue would be really useful, because as I say, I think we need to input our point of view, perhaps after this meeting rather than today. Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you. I found that very helpful. I mean, I think you're right that we do need to agree how we'll take it forward. We have the consultation with HMT as well, and any questions for that, we're going to need to submit those questions well in advance. So if you could submit to I think it's probably Roger, isn't it, as chair of the cost effectiveness committee that's looking at that one. I'm
a bit confused now where we are with what we're going through at the moment. I mean, I thought the purpose of this board meeting was to actually go through what our reply is, and you know, we pitched it very much, I think, picking up some of Matt's points there, that you know and so we haven't been too specific in many questions. We have answered questions back, but so I mean, are we still saying that this is going to be our initial reply at this stage?
So I think what we're saying, firstly, we have the meeting with HMT and some questions to get, and it would be useful to collate a list on that, and either you or I could collate that list of questions that we want to ask, because that's another forum to ask some questions on. We then will have the 8 weeks to prepare a reply to the consultations as a whole. So that was the 19th of August date, is that, if I've got that one correctly. This, we've put a draft here, but I think what Matt is saying is he would like a bit more time to feed that in. And I'm very happy for him to sort of come back and come back with more thoughts on that. Some of what we've said anyway is where we'll be asking for more information. We may conclude, as we've said, that actually what we need to be pointing out is that the objectives of certain things aren't clear. And we're hearing that in that discussion. So I'm very happy to reflect that in any sort of reply that the SAB as a whole puts in. Referring back to you was simply just in terms of who's handling the questions for the HMT engagement session.
Yeah, and I think clearly our you know, initial draft, you know, makes those comments that there are more questions than answers in some of these issues.
Yeah, so I don't think. I think probably a lot of it will sort of stand, as it were, as it goes forward, but I can understand needing a little bit more time in order to feed into that one. Is that a good place to leave this side of it and to move? But since we've only got 10 minutes of sort of scheduled time left, to move on then to the discount rate methodology.
Yeah, I think so, John. So we didn't cover this in as great a granular detail as we did the cost control mechanism, but there were some key things that we did want to pull out in our response and that we did talk through. So if I just sort of combine the first 5 questions around the escape rate itself, the first thing that we did want to clarify with Treasury was the question on objectives. So essentially the transparent and simple objective, we did just want to clarify where that had gone and what their thoughts were on that. Just going through this, the main theme of the discussion was that ultimately, if we stick with the current if the current approach is used, so the current GDP approach is used, there's going to be a material increase in costs. So that there's clearly a need to look at this, which is why Treasury have looked at this and are asking us these questions. It seems to me given the focus on the stability objective from Treasury, it seems to me that and given the stability of the social time preference rate over the last 20 years, it seems to me that there's a bit of a lean in there towards that, I would say. It's not immediately clear from the consultation, but there are some subtle signs there, I think. And if we just cover the first 5 questions, the main one we had was just to sort of make some high level points there about the need for transparency, and also picking up on that point in that there's a bit of a disconnect potentially between the escape rate and the rate that would be used in the economic check, and just sort of making those initial high level points. If I just come on to question 6 or 7, and then we can kind of talk about this section as a whole. On the equalities impact, we just wanted to stress the point to Treasury that fire, as always, is a little different. So there's the knock-on impact potentially of a change in escape rate on commutation factors, which doesn't affect majority of the other public service schemes who just have a fixed 12-to-1. So we just wanted to sort of highlight that to Treasury and make sure that they'd considered sort of the intergenerational issues arising there of members retiring at different times with different level of factors. The final question, which was probably the easiest one out of the 2 consultations and one we could probably get agreement on today, although I won't try and do that, is that we do think it's sensible to align the SCAPE review with the valuations. Valuations are once every 4 years, having a discount rate review every 10 years. Whilst there's potentially arguments for that, we think aligning to the valuation cycle to sort of make things slightly easier and slightly sort of easier to plan, and sort of fewer surprises being sprung on you in the intervening years. I appreciate that was a fairly quick rattle through of SCAPE. We did have, as a committee, we did have sort of the bulk of our conversation on the cost control mechanism for, as we kind of felt that was where we were able to add most value and most input. But I guess any comments from the group on that? Roger, I can see you got your hand up, but I don't know if that's an old hand again.
No, it was an old hand, but I'll say, yeah. I mean, you know, certainly on the valuation cycle, I think everybody's, as I said earlier at the start, I think everybody will be on the same paragraph on that one. But yeah, I think as with the previous, I think what we've drawn out here and hopefully put before you is a good basis for those other discussions.
Can I ask, Roger has made some comments earlier on that I think probably were different from anything we discussed at that particular meeting. And I wondered if Roger was still on and might actually want to say what he might actually want to see go in a reply.
You mean Roger H?
The other Roger.
Other Roger, sorry.
Hi, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, if we were to vary away from the SCAPE methodology, which, I mean, I recognise it's a lower discount rate, so it's an increase on current burden. But part of the objective back in 2011, if I understand it correctly, and I was in the pensions business then, was to avoid making current pension provision to a level which was increasingly unaffordable. In other words, this is part of the burden on the taxpayer argument. If we use a discount rate which is unfeasibly large, and certainly the social time preference rate is not something which the growth in the tax base is going to achieve without substantial help, i.e. increasing tax rates, then we are placing a future burden on future taxpayers, because we will naturally increase the level of benefit to current beneficiaries to match. We'll spend what we can. We want to do the best thing for our pensioners. We want to do the best thing for for the firefighters and employees. So we'll do as much as we can, and we'll think we can do more because we're using too high a discount rate. I think it's a real risk. I think we're storing up big problems for the future. And I would personally strongly resist the temptation to move away from the GDP-based methodology of scape.
And I expect that that argument is going to be advanced. I have wondered, and we've talked, I think, in the past about some sort of linkage, at least between the two. And if they were to move too far apart, then you would need to consider a review of the methodology. But it doesn't necessarily mean that for 0.5% or 1% change, you know, that might become deemed acceptable. You start to have another corridor within it or something like that. You know, I'm fairly sure that people will advance your arguments.
I just don't think that we should be using an investment hurdle rate for a liability discount rate. You're using the wrong thing to the wrong purpose.
What do the actuaries on this?
I think it's a really interesting point raised by Roger, and it is one that we didn't cover at the subcommittee. I guess from putting myself in, and to an extent, I agree with everything he said. Putting myself in Treasury's shoes, it's essentially, again, I don't want to put words in Treasury's mouth. They can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sticking with the GDP approach. Sticking with the GDP approach unaltered is an immediate increase in costs that they have to fund on day one. Moving to an alternate approach arguably puts more costs that they may have to spend in year 10, 20, 30. So I can see the attraction from Treasury's point of view.
Can I come back on that? And I don't think we can fool ourselves into thinking this isn't real. If you're using a false discount rate, and I've used the word false unadvisedly, but it is a target rate of return, not a discount rate that you're suggesting that we use, then you are giving a false impression today of the cost of these pensions. The objective surely must be as accurate as we possibly can be. We are dealing with assumptions, so we are always going to have a massive margin of error. Yeah, the assumptions will never be correct. But to knowingly use a false assumption, I think we are doing a disservice to ourselves, to the pensioners and the taxpayers. It costs what it costs. Out there in the real world, you don't get protection from the variability of the economy. If you're in a defined contribution scheme and return rates go down, you get less pension. Yeah, if they go down within the year before you actually buy your annuity, you get a lot less pension. That's what really happens out there. If you're in a defined benefit scheme, you will be making contributions, and if the rate of return in the real economy on the assets in the fund go down, you will get a reduced pension, or you will have to jack up your contribution rates quite substantially. We here are already offering a phenomenally good deal to any pensioner in this scheme. To be putting all of the protections that we're now talking about around increased stability, we are putting it into a position where we are deceiving ourselves. It is not a real situation, and the consequence of that is at some stage in the future we end up cutting services to pay for it.
Thank you, and I mean, as I say, I do expect people to argue that one, and ultimately, I guess Treasury will make that decision. I think, you know, we may include something about those types of things as well in our answer, saying that we recognise there's two views, you know, on this, or that as I say, some sort of linkage might be possible, and that perhaps one could think a bit more about that.
I wonder what the counter view is. What is the view that represents that we should use an inappropriate discount rate?
Sam, I'm not sorry. I'm coming to you next, not necessarily to express the counter view.
No, not to express the counter view. I was just going to flag that when the consultation was run in 2011, there were actually 4 options that were being considered for the discount rate. And within the response to the consultation in 2011, the point that you're making, Roger, was made in that consultation response, that by using an STPR rate that is higher than the long run GDP, you are likely to, you know, be storing up a future claim.
Inevitably, not likely.
Which is why I expect to see it again.
Yeah, so I think just helpful and informing these views and opinions and things, even to look back to the 2011 consultation response, there are quite some, you know, good arguments in there that you might want to refer to.
Any other questions from people? That was a terribly technical part of the argument, really. So I think that brings us to the end, doesn't it, of the questions that we have to answer on that. And I think we've talked through the process as well of getting answers, which is perhaps that we've got a very good first draft here, and the things that the Cost Effectiveness Committee has done, which I'd like to thank them for in putting that first draft forward. And we'll be continuing to work on that, I guess, but also informed by what we hear from HMT, who have some of the members of the SAB are attending that, but I think attendance is restricted in terms of numbers. So hopefully those of you that wanted to attend are able to do so, and do keep, when Matt in particular, when you have sort of formed your views, then you know, have a chat and let us know in a way what there are, and we can try and sort of make sure that what the response that goes in properly represents everybody's views. But you know, this has been a very, very technical session, and I think everybody's done tremendously well actually in terms of the sort of degree of debate that we've had here. And you know, I think it's useful as well to stick to some extent to some of the principles of, you know, what do we feel about stability overall, you know, as well as some of the sort of technical arguments and you know, how important are various objectives to us. So unless there's any other points, can I bring the meeting to a close? Have we got any other business?
No, we haven't got anything to raise.
So thank you all very much for your attendance. And thank you for the government actuary as well for attending as guests.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Keep safe.
Okay. I wonder whether Claire might stay on, but